So from analysing the advert from the British Tourist Board, we can generate and see there are some quite clear feelings uh, about Britain from that advert. And it makes us think, what is Britishness? Is it a feeling? Is it a state of mind that we have? Is it a privilege for us or even a birthright? However we consider it, what we now know as media students and what we know from deconstructing that advert is that Britishness is a construction. Any representation of Britishness has to be seen as a construction. Whether we're looking at films or advertising, magazines or newspapers, we know that every single representation has been mediated, and we have to consider Britishness in the same way. So if we're looking at representation, we may as well look at stereotypes. Here are some of the old, obvious British stereotypes from film, TV and newspapers. We see the floppy-haired English romantic gent in Hugh Grant, the Morris dancer, the bowler-hatted city gent, and of course the chav. Now, in regards to the chav, we've looked at this before. We've looked at it as a stereotype that has actually been constructed to, in some ways, undermine certain sections of the working classes. That actually it's a stereotype perpetuated by the media, potentially to undermine and to keep the working classes down. So what about the other stereotypes here? Are these harmful, or are they just harmless shortcuts? Are they politically motivated? Let's take what might seem like a strange example in the bottom left with Mike Myers' portrayal of Austin Powers. One of the things noticeable about Austin Powers is his bad teeth. And this is a stereotype you've probably heard or seen in particularly American media. The British are always portrayed as having bad teeth. Now, where does that come from? Is it just a humorous concept, just a joke, a way of creating a caricature? Or is there anything ideological in it? Can we apply what we would call a hegemonic reading? Well, ideologically, we are separate from America, despite culturally being very quite close. There are some significant differences between our society in England and Britain and the society in America. One of those fundamental differences is the free healthcare system we have in the form of our National Health Service. America has never had this, and in fact, for the past few years, Barack Obama has been the first president to seriously consider it a possibility for their society. However, many people in the United States are still ideologically opposed to this. We've had free healthcare and an NHS for 65 years now. Whereas in America, many citizens and politicians view a national health service with suspicion. They are ideologically opposed to it. So could this stereotype of the British having bad teeth, could this be a warning? Could it be used as a warning to suggest this is what happens if you have a subsidised or even a free healthcare system? There are other negative stereotypes that we see as well. The archetypal football hooligan is a stereotype we've unfortunately seen for many years now. News footage of these hooligans is beamed and is printed across the world in newspapers and news reports. These we would consider to be a negative stereotype. However, the media again will use this stereotype in a variety of ways, maybe not even in a negative way always. Films such as Green Street, or with its American title Football Hooligans, the movies of celebrities such as Danny Dyer are often use this kind of stereotype in their characters. Britishness, or the concept of Britishness, can also be used and exploited. We look at these three icons of Britain, really, the Union Jack flag, the British Bulldog, and of course on the right there, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister who led us through the Second World War and is often considered the greatest Briton of all time. We can have no doubt about the fact that these are all iconic of Britain. They all say something about Britishness perhaps, but what on earth have they got to do with insurance? Absolutely nothing. And yet Churchill Insurance Company used so many of these icons of Britain to convince us that their organisation, their insurance company, is as reliable as Winston Churchill, is as British as the British Bulldog or the Union flag. And we're supposed to consider that the company itself holds many of the ideologies we hold in our national identity. If you look, do some research, even watch television for an evening, flick through a magazine, you'll often see that much advertising uses patriotism, uses Britishness as a way of selling its products. But it's not only corporations and companies hijacking Britishness as part of its advertising, politicians as well. Nick Griffin on the right here, who is the leader of the British Nationalist Party, is imitating Winston Churchill's iconic victory salute, trying to convince people that he shares the same values that Winston Churchill had himself, when the opposite may be true. The many of the policies of his British Nationalist Party are surrounding race, homosexuality and attitudes towards the Holocaust are more similar to the Nazi Party that Churchill was fighting. And yet Griffin wants to convince his audience that by using the iconic victory salute of Churchill, that he is in some way similar. Britishness can be summed up in really simple ways, in simple media texts. This poster of a family in an Anderson shelter, which was a bomb shelter used during the Second World War, and one line of copy, Spirit of the Blitz, actually sums up so much of what we might consider to be British. And if we look at the ideologies of the text represented here, we can start adding together some of the things that we might consider being British. There's a great sense of community, for example, of looking after one's family and maybe an extended family. Of course, being in the bomb shelter, we know that this is dangerous times, so there is a great sense of bravery and courage represented here. The ideology is obviously smiling in the face of adversity, protecting each other. And overriding all of this is that now cliche, keep calm and carry on. All of these ideologies are presented in this text in a pretty much straightforward way. They seem really like they're common sense ideologies. However, as we know, this is just a construction. Let's remind ourselves of how something can be portrayed as common sense and how it can be used by the ruling and dominant classes. And this is where we come back to this idea of hegemony. This is Antonio Gramsci, who is a Marxist philosopher who really sort of pioneered and told us a lot about what hegemony is. In his view, the bourgeoisie or the ruling classes are successful in projecting their view of the world as natural and common sense, something to be taken for granted and legitimised. Although what we have to remember is that it only serves their interests. The bourgeoisie or the ruling classes view becomes the consensus view because it's treated as common sense. What we also have to consider about hegemony is that it's potentially always threatened. It can actually only be maintained by the consent of the subordinate classes. The subordinate classes, the working classes, the majority of people can actually challenge this hegemony, and the consensus can be broken. So society is therefore seen as a constant struggle between ideologies competing for hegemony. Let's think of an example where the hegemony has been broken. If we go back 100 years, 150 years, 200 years, we lived in a society where men were absolutely dominant. Our politicians, our leaders, our rulers were pretty much all men, and that includes our thinkers in society and most of our artists as well. However, over time, through a suffragette movement, through equal rights for women movements, political movements, bit by bit, slowly but surely, the hegemony has been broken. Equality for women is now taken for granted, but it came over a long time, many, many years of struggle. So, hegemony can be challenged. It is seen as a struggle between ideologies. Let's look at another philosopher who considered ideas similar to hegemony, and we'll look at Roland Barthes, who was a French literary critic, a social theorist and semiologist. And someone who we'll look at a lot in media studies, but for now we'll consider his ideas of mythologies. He would often interrogate pieces of cultural material, media texts. He would expose how bourgeois society uses them to assert its values upon others, similar to hegemony. For instance, his example is the portrayal of French wine. In society, in France, wine is seen as robust and healthy habit, and that's a bourgeois ideal perception, whereas the actual truth contradicts this. The reality are that wine can obviously be unhealthy and inebriating. He found that by deconstructing certain signs, we can understand more about bourgeois ideologies. So this is similar to hegemony. By deconstructing media texts, we can see that the bourgeois, the ruling dominant classes, can actually assert certain ideas upon us. So let's go back to our Spirit of the Blitz text and apply a hegemonic reading. In fact, by looking at Roland Barthes' ideas of mythologies, what we can actually see is that there's as much missing from this text as there is that's there. To understand the text and how it portrays its ideologies as common sense, what we should maybe consider are what this text doesn't tell us. Obviously, being set in the Blitz, we're aware that this would be a time not only of courage and bravery, but of terrible fear, of panic. Whilst the text might celebrate a togetherness and a feeling of community, of course many communities were devastated by the bombs that were dropped in our cities, that this might celebrate a collective and celebrating life. Of course many people lost their lives, and whilst we see the family together, of course the war meant that families were separated. Some young children evacuated to the countryside, men were enlisted into the army, the navy or the air force and taken away from their loved ones. So this tells us some things about Britishness, but it also leaves out a lot about what was happening. So from a hegemonic point of view, why would the ruling classes do this? Well, I don't think it's as straightforward as propaganda, but more to do with creating morale, of reinforcing certain ideas and making people feel like they are together. In a time of great fear, obviously a feeling of community is going to help the war effort. So there are kind of benevolent reasons why the ruling classes, the dominant classes, would want to create a mythology of what it meant to be British. There are lots of other mythologies created about Britain, and they're things you need to consider and put under scrutiny as well. There is, of course, an opposing view to this. Rather than looking at Britishness and the ideologies of Britishness as a purely a myth or a hegemony created by the ruling classes, we could say the opposing view to this is pluralism, the idea that people actually create this sense of Britishness and that we ourselves are responsible for generating an ideology of Britishness. The texts in front of you are virals. They're from a website called We Are Not Afraid. This website appeared just days after the 7/7 bombings in London. And basically the point of the website was for people, individuals, to send in their own virals, their own images with the central message, we're not afraid. Some of them were using intertextual references to film posters, as you can see with the Shaun of the Dead and the Yoda. Some were using iconic British elements, things that are stereotypically British, like the Union flag in the bottom right and the tube sign in the top left. Nearly all of these images were photoshopped. Some included photographs of families and people, loved ones close to them. This website sprung out of nowhere, and within days there were millions of photos uploaded to it. So, what about this idea of pluralism? Is this idea of Britishness, the stiff upper lip, the keep calm and carry on, the sense of community and the sense of courage, is this something created by the people rather than it just being a mythology created by the ruling and dominant classes? And this will always be the argument. Do we take a pluralist stance, that the media is controlled by us, created by us, our ideologies are informed by the masses, or this hegemonic model, whereby the representations we see in our media are dictated by the ruling classes, because it suits them? Well, you'll have to decide which you find is the most convincing through looking at a number of different representations and studying them and scrutinising them as Barth did with his mythologies.